Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar today on community engagement and customer service. My name is Catherine O'Regan, and I'm here with Professor Ed Blakely. We're from the Cities Leadership Institute, and the Cities Leadership Institute is a not-for-profit that delivers a range of programs, all aimed at increasing leadership capacity and the skills, particularly in local government, so that we can be great urban leaders. One of the things that we have been doing is with the federal government have been organising masterclasses and masterclasses by webinar such as this one today on a range of subjects. And one of the things that we found particularly interesting is that community engagement has been top of the list for people in local government to see how smart cities can actually help engage the community better. When we started going doing these masterclasses, it quickly became apparent that there are 4 cornerstones to becoming a smart city. There's community engagement and customer service. There's actually becoming a culture of innovation. And how do we finance and fund and have our procurement processes aligned to delivering smart cities? And one of the other big questions around urban data: what do we collect, why do we collect, and what do we do with the data that we collect? And how do we actually govern the many activities and initiatives that can be part of our smart cities strategy? But today is actually focused on the first cornerstone, community engagement and customer service. And I'm pleased to be able to be here today with a number of colleagues from around the world. And I know from the registration of the attendees today that we also have people from around the world listening. So welcome to everybody. Our first speaker is Diane Miller, and she'll be followed by Joel Fredericks. And they will have very different perspectives of how each and every one of you can work with your communities to improve the engagement that you have for the different projects that you may be leading. Then we'll move to a panel discussion, and Professor Blakely will be leading that one for us so that you can actually hear from both the presenters and look at some of the different questions and probe into some of the issues that they raise a little bit further. And at the end of the session, we'll also want to hear from you and look at what questions and answers that you may have to help solve the problems that you're confronting at the moment. If you haven't used this platform before, one of the things you can do is submit your questions online. You'll notice that there is a panel or a dashboard on the side of your screen where you can submit and type in your questions. Please feel free to put your questions in at any time when a speaker is presenting, because you don't want to forget it towards the end, and we'll collect those and be able to come back to as many of those as possible as we move through to questions and answers. So I hope that covers most of the logistics and the introduction, and we can potentially now move to our first presenter of the day, which is Diane. And Diane, I think, is one of the very interesting speakers that we were meeting recently on our international exchange on smart cities. She's someone who has a very unique blend of skills and experience across a range of project management, civic engagement, and group process design. She specialises in both designing, facilitating, but also implementing projects across a diverse range of groups. She's worked closely with local government, businesses and community groups for over 15 years, and has designed and executed a number of collaborative, multi-stakeholder projects to raise awareness, mobilise action, as well as look at community planning and sustainability. One of the reasons where I think Diane can provide some unique insights as well is that she comes from the area of organisational development. So she's focused on that leadership and teamwork and change. All the way from Austin in Texas, Diane's sitting there waiting. It's not too late in the day, so thank you very much for your patience and commitment, Di. But if we hand over to you to give us our first insight into community engagement.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint right now, so you'll start seeing my screen. Hopefully everything will work. All righty. So I can no longer see you, but hopefully you guys can all see my presentation. The first slide Catherine, are you still able to tell me, is it all working?
It's looking good for me. Thank you.
Great, great, great. So the conversation I wanted to have with y'all today is, now do I need to share my webcam with y'all too? I think maybe is that good? Or did I just mess things up? All right.
Yes, that looks.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'll put it back on. This is not my usual format. All right. So yeah. So the conversation I wanted to have was really around what are the key strategies for successful public engagement as folks working in different cities and jurisdictions, or maybe in other organizations. You know, what are those kind of ingredients? What's the formula? Some of the formula for having some success in public engagement. So really, how do we go from this? We've all seen, certainly here in the United States, we've seen plenty of this really angry kind of us-them sort of scenario to a different kind of conversation, right? So one where folks from different backgrounds and with different perspectives and even different interests in the issue can still come together in a thoughtful and civil manner. So that's the question. Yes?
I'm just going to interrupt. I just want to double check that your PowerPoint is showing.
Oh, my screen. All right.
Yeah.
Let's see. How's that looking? Does that work for you now?
I'm only seeing your webcam.
All right, I'm going to turn off the webcam. And now, do you see my screen? Because I did hit the button to show my screen. Is that not working?
I'm not seeing your PowerPoint. I'm just double checking with our technician and seeing if we can do this. My apologies, everybody.
No problem.
Well, this is engagement.
Yeah, that's great.
Forms.
Technology. So yeah, Catherine, so what's on my screen is my first PowerPoint slide. So, and then the little buttons, I've got both my microphone on and the button that I think is the share my screen. So.
Okay, thank you.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. All right, I'm going to keep going. All right, so how do we move from this, right? This is the kind of what we're seeing a lot in town halls, right? In certainly in the United States, but in other places as well. How do we move from that kind of dynamic to something where people can really deliberate and talk together and work through complex public policy issues? So the conversation I want to have today, and these are the items we're going to be talking about, is what are some of the changing views? Like, where's really kind of the mindset regarding public engagement? What are some of the principles? What are some of the guiding North Stars of this work that we should really be paying attention to? And then we're going to look at what is the spectrum of engagement? How do we know what we're really after, and how do we start to then design effective processes? I'll walk through a quick example of an engagement project that I've done here in Austin that I think kind of gets at some of brings some of those components together in an effective way. And then I'll leave you with a few resources. So that'll be my 20 minutes with y'all. So Catherine, you did such a great job of introducing me. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but it was really about just kind of having gone from that world of corporate culture change and working with teams and leaders to really, my passion was really around civic culture change. How do we work together across divides? And a great learning ground for me was when I moved from Illinois to Texas in the late 90s. I got involved in working for a regional nonprofit that was focused on dealing with growth issues. How are we going to deal with our population growth in Central Texas, where we double in a population every 20 years? So this was a long-range effort to involve business, government, community leaders, regular citizens in a conversation about how to shape growth and really find that common ground for dealing with issues like transportation and affordability. And we're still struggling with all those issues today, but it was a very important kind of juncture in my career. And then in about 2010, I struck out on my own and formed my firm, Civic Collaboration. So, yeah, let's see. Hopefully you can still see me with these slides. So hopefully on your screen, there's a slide that says public engagement is not. And sometimes figuring out what something is, it's helpful to think about what it's not. And it's not selling something. If you've already figured out something and you are just trying to convince or sell people, you really don't need to be doing public engagement. That's more communication or even public information or public relations, PR. It's not about getting votes or convincing or getting everybody together so everybody can find fault. It's really, and it's certainly not 3 minutes at a citizen communication, even though that's very much at a council meeting, that's often how it shows up. And it's really, not a process where the staff or the convening entity is controlling all the outcomes. So it is a bit about letting go of control. So the kind of core guiding value behind this work is that the public should have a say in the decisions about those actions that could affect their lives. So that's really, that comes from the International Association of Public Participation's core values for public engagement practitioners. That's actually the first value in their list. So that's really key to keep in mind. So I was talking about changing views, and the concept of kind of being a customer, and I know you've got customer service in your language, and organizations do want to be of service and provide high quality service, but really in these complex challenges that communities are really working hard to find a path forward together, really changing from the community member, the resident, being a customer, right? They as if government was a vending machine where you put your money in and you pull the button and out pops your service, that really shifting that mindset away from that to citizen, right? And so some of those qualities of customer about really letting others define the need and kind of saying, hey, okay, I want my services, but not really being focused on what the implications are beyond their own discrete interests, that shifts when you really start to think in terms of citizen, when your mindset is more around collective ownership, and that really we need to co-create our futures together. And so that mind shift is really pretty key to the work of public engagement. And when you have a shift in mindset, hopefully you have a corresponding shift in behaviors. So being able to kind of shift citizens to shift their behaviors, but it also takes a shift in behaviors around the staff or organizations or even the elected officials and their way of looking at the constituents, the citizens, the residents in their municipality or their kind of town or village, and really understanding, being open to alternatives, being open to citizens' views, having the tough one, letting a little bit letting go of control, and really letting the outcomes not be so predetermined, but really you're focused on the process and a stance of listening. And it's a big shift too, often for elected officials, because often they're viewed as, we need to know all of the information and we would have the knowledge to make the decision. And it's really key to have an openness to ideas and know when to lead and when decisions have to be made, but also when to kind of let the community members start to articulate where things are headed in order to really make sure that the solutions you develop are going to be sustainable. So this is a very short list. When I do this talk with other groups, we're in more of an in-person setting, and hopefully we'll talk about some of this when we have our Q&A. I'm sure you all have lots of information on your list. You'd have a lot more bullets about why this work is hard, why that shift is hard, the shift in mindset, the shift in behaviors. And so we'll get into more of what are some of the challenges to this work. But, there are benefits, right? And really the heart of this work around doing really effective public engagement is that you will have more lasting, durable, and sustainable decisions. And that when things get implemented, if they're built on a really strong foundation, then you don't have to kind of go back and undo all of that work. You kind of get shared agreement around where things are headed. And yeah, there's always issues that come up, but folks are really much more comfortable with where things are headed when they've been engaged early in the decision-making process. And you can unleash a lot of creativity through this work. And another real important value is building community, right? So not just between your governmental entity and the community, but within the community itself. But the challenge is it takes a while, and it's not necessarily cheap, and it's certainly not easy. So those are just a few of some of the challenge areas. So here's some core principles to keep in mind when thinking about public engagement. And I won't read these to you, but they were developed by this organization that I served on the board of for years called the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. And I found them to be really helpful North Stars to serve as like a checklist, right, as a framework to think about what do we need to be paying attention to when we're developing our public engagement efforts. And things like inclusion are really clearly predominantly a big topic and something that you need to really focus on. And transparency, and how do you build trust? So these are the where we're headed, the North Star, and then we'll talk about some of the ways to get there. Another tool besides the NCDD's guiding principles is the International Association of Public Participation. So these two organizations are organizations that practitioners of public engagement like myself and folks from government and a lot of different doorways, people come into these organizations. And they're really wonderful in as much as they share these incredible resources. It's a strong learning community. And one of the best tools that has really grounded this work and that's been used a lot with a lot of different communities is the IAP2 public engagement spectrum. And it basically tells you three things. What is your goal? What is the public's role in the process, and what technique? So this slide focuses on the goal, and you'll see the arrow at the top talks about the increasing levels of public impact that can go all the way to from inform. We just need to let you know that something's happening, and to involve, which most of the public engagement work that I've done and seen done kind of falls in this involve, maybe to collaborate realm, to true empowerment, which is pretty uncommon, but of course voting and other efforts like that are fall in that at that end of the spectrum. So the spectrum gives you a way to kind of think about your public engagement effort and where it falls as far as, is it just inform, or are we really talking collaboration and empowerment? And that calls for very different approaches. So the promise you're making under each of these categories or each of these realms on the spectrum is listed here. And at the end, I'll show you the website where you all can get all of these information you can download directly, so you don't have to worry about writing all this stuff down. But the promise to the public is really key. And so it's really important when you start an engagement process to understand, what are you really committing to? What are you telling the community that this effort that will produce? Like, how will what they have to say make any kind of difference in what you're doing? And the different techniques, the methods you would use would vary based on where along the spectrum your public engagement effort happens to fall. So you would do different kinds of processes based on what the effort is really calling for. So you'd be communicating differently. You'd make sure to kind of think about, what's the feedback loop? Are we telling people what we did with their input? And you'll be thinking about this as you're designing your public engagement process. So on that, I've put together this slide that really kind of captures the process I use when starting a public engagement effort with a client. And I'll talk with them and walk through these stages with them, and jumping ahead to kind of, well, wow, what kind of meeting should we have? We should do a World Cafe, that would be great. Well, we can't start there. That's the selecting the types of engagement. What we really need to do is identify, what is the decision-making process? What's happening with this program or initiative or project? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the purpose? And what are the goals? But specifically, what is the purpose of the public's input and the role in that process? And being really, really clear on that. And then you work through, who are the stakeholders? Who's impacted? What is the situation, the history, the relationships? It's not until you do all of that work that you then start to think about, what types of engagement efforts. Should I do a big community meeting at the very beginning? Should we do small neighborhood-based meetings? What, should we do just an online survey? What is it we're going to do? So that'll be informed by all this prior work. And then you would actually design a process and really think through how you're going to implement and manage that process. And throughout, you're going to evaluate what you're doing and feedback lessons learned. into your decision making and kind of into this whole model. So some key questions to think about before beginning a public engagement process. You know, are we ready? Have we identified what our own internal decision-making process is? I've really found that so interesting over the years that organizations and clients of mine often they're not totally sure exactly what their process is. So mapping that out and being really clear and where does the public input fit into that process? How are you going to use what people have to say? If you're not going to use the results of the work, the input you're gathering, then, you know, kind of like my advice is don't ask for input. And then these other questions, are we really prepared to kind of focus our control over to process rather than outcomes? Are we going early enough in the decision-making process? This is a really key one. A lot of times engagement happens kind of in some ways too late in the process, and things are already either become contentious or they're kind of more fully baked than allows for the kinds of conversation that the public can engage in, which are really about their values and the things they hold important and the kinds of things they'd like to see in their communities. So that's a real key question. And then do you have the budget, and are we ready, and do we have what we need to do this and do it well? So those are questions to ask before ever starting an engagement process. I included this slide because I wanted to touch a little bit on some core principles for when you're thinking about kind of really any community meeting or any time you're with a group of people. A colleague of mine, Sarah Reed, put this together. Her firm is called the Communications Center. And as a facilitator, as a person who facilitates meetings with groups, I find it very helpful to kind of think about the stages you go through when a group comes together. So this model is just a way to kind of touch on the fact that really kind of any time we're involving and engaging people, whether it's a very short interaction at a booth at a public fair, or whether it's a full stakeholder workshop where you're working, you know, spending a half a day with community members, visioning for the future of their community, you're going to really likely go through a lot of these stages. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of length on this, but it's a really important thing to be really clear with folks in the, kind of in that greeting and focus and inform stage when folks are first gathering. What is it we're here for? What are we going to be using this information for? What's the purpose, and what's the process you'll experience during the time that we are together? And then during the circular process in the bottom, it's really about inviting input and encouraging involvement, and the accept is really around acknowledging and capturing and summarizing and letting folks know, yeah, we got what you said, we heard it. And then guiding is really around more inquiry and understanding and helping folks kind of work through issues. And then you review what we've done. Well, here's what we heard, here's how it ties into what we're doing, and then that send forth piece about thanking people. So I just wanted to give this to you. I found it as a helpful tool to kind of even think about engagement processes overall. How can we make sure we're going through this cycle when we're involving folks in the community? So to kind of bring this to kind of a focused example, I wanted to cover for you a particular project, or share with you a particular project I worked on here in the Austin area with the local school district. The Eanes School District is a pretty wealthy school district in the western part of Austin, and the organization that hired me and that partnered to convene these dialogues is called the E3 Alliance, which is a nonprofit that's looking at how, from pre-K to post-secondary, how can we make sure that students have the tools they need, and that the education pipeline, right, that we can make sure that we have a strong economy because we have a strong education system. So this was a few years ago, and we co-created a process that walked folks through this conversation about how they could prepare students for their future. So really the school district was going to be going after a big bond, and knew that it hadn't kind of doing strategic planning, and they hadn't checked in with the community in a while, and they knew they needed to do that. So they wanted to do a dialogue series and a deliberative process before they started telling folks, here's what we're going to do, and here's where things are headed. And so these were some of the goals to really understand what the community felt was important with regard to preparing students for their futures. So the process, I talked a little bit about this. We did organize a very in-depth steering committee that really was fantastic and hands-on. And so every player in these public engagement processes kind of has their job. And this particular effort was over a series of a month. We met once a week for a month and had students, teachers, community members, parents, academics, business owners. We got a cross-section from the community. And we engaged them in a structured and moderated process, a deliberative process where folks could really examine values and different options for how we might move forward as a community. And we had volunteers to help host those table conversations and capture the output. And it was really interesting. What we did, we had a discussion guide, which I found is somewhat unique in some of these engagement processes. We actually provided people with a framework, a way of thinking about how we might prepare students for their future. And each one focused on a particular possible path forward, but there were all, within each are kind of like trade-offs. You know, there were some positives for that possible focus area, but also some trade-offs. So over the series of convenings, we had the mixed groups of attendees and small table conversations work through these different possible paths forward. And it was really quite interesting because folks were able to exchange ideas and perspectives, and none of those three scenarios was something that they said, yeah, that's the one. They actually came up with their own set of themes and ideas and insights that emerged, and from that they developed action plans. So it really was about doing a process where the community could really own the outcomes and look at the true barriers to what it would take to accomplish that, and what different players needed to do, not just the school district, but all of the different players, including the business community and the residents and teachers. So I view this as a really kind of, on that spectrum I showed you, it was kind of on the collaborate, very much on that end of the spectrum. And it had some really great legacy effects of, kind of getting these insights articulated and captured about what the community felt was most important in order for the Eanes School District to help these high school students be successful, which is captured there, but also to really have some tangible action plans and ideas for what people could volunteer and do going forward. You know, four meetings, that's great, but what are you going to do? And so these are just some highlights of what the community members felt was valuable about the process and what they enjoyed and what they would do differently. And so, and this is a few years back. I haven't stayed in close touch, but I believe their bond was successful, which was a big deal. But also it sparked one woman, one of the committee members is now, I think two of them are now on the school board, and they started doing stuff in partnership with the local community. And there are a lot of retirees in this community, and so they really started getting them more involved in the school. In fact, it was just Veterans Day here last week, and I remember one of the projects that came out of this was to invite in veterans from the local area and have them kind of have a story sharing opportunity with these high school age students. So lots of really great stuff as a result of this kind of really more robust engagement process, which kind of falls on that collaborate end of the spectrum. So I just wanted to show you that as kind of a case study. These two organizations I mentioned, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, those three resources there, the engagement principles I mentioned, and also the engagement streams framework is a great resource you can download for free, as well as the public engagement resource guide, which was written really for folks that work for government and different agencies. And then the International Association of Public Participation, at their website, IAP2, you can download that spectrum and other resources which are really helpful when you start thinking about your engagement processes and how you want to design them. So just kind of in recap, here's what we covered, and I hope we'll circle back around. I mean, I know we're going to be in conversation, so that'll be great, so we can kind of dig deeper on some of these topics. There's my contact information. I've got my little timer running, and I'm a little over my 20 minutes, so I'll let you, Catherine, take back the screen.
Thank you, Di. That was a great presentation. One of the things that when I was doing this business, I said it's all about who decides who decides.
Yep. That's right.
And clearly, you're really into that, helping people understand who decides.
Right.
We're going to move into how you use technology in that. I'm sure you've used a lot in your days. But there are a couple of things. There's 4 steps in this technology piece. One is assessing who participates, finding out who's out there. You use technology for that. You use technology to form people to come to the meetings and things like that. But in the meetings, you can use your phones and the like to vote and so on and communicate to the entire community what that was about for a spread effect. And then finally, when you get to the point where Diane's talking about running workshops and things like this, you get more and more people involved, even if they're not present in the room. So we're going to hear from somebody, Joel Fredericks of the Design Lab at the University of Sydney, who's a PhD student working on collaborative city making. And Joel and his team have written a lot of articles and books on this subject, and everything from the hard stuff like roads and rails and energy to the soft stuff like community participation. So welcome, Joel.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, well, basically, I have been doing a PhD over the last 3 years, which I've submitted now. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is how you can collaboratively design community engagement with a variety of top-down and bottom-up stakeholders. And particularly what I did it through was through pop-up interventions placed in public space. So basically, for me is that my background originally comes from urban planning. As part of that, I did a lot of community engagement work, then moving into working as a community and stakeholder engagement consultant. And then what I can kind of call myself on the outset is a collaborative designer, and that's collaboratively designing with a variety of stakeholders. So, look, Diane briefly discussed before the IAP2 spectrum, but there's also other ones out there like the Wheel of Participation and Einstein's Ladder, which kind of informs how we assess levels of community engagement. And this is my very basic standardized version of an engagement spectrum, and how it can be applied in community engagement. And there's kind of 2 components to it. You have an objectives of your engagement, you actually engage, and then you have your decision making after that. And then the other kind of bit that is underneath that is the planning stage, the deployment, so you're actually doing your engagement, and then the post-deployment. So I'll kind of come back to that as I start to talk. Okay, so because we're talking about smart cities, I just wanted to show this picture about a utopian smart city. And interestingly, I recently had to give a lecture to a whole lot of design computing students that are doing a project around digital placemaking and playful cities, and essentially how you can activate public spaces or create activity in public spaces. And so this is kind of a good example of great and grand ideas. And basically what I was trying to get through to these students was that from a design perspective, or from an intentions perspective, what your grand and great ideas or best intentions might not necessarily work for everybody, and particularly the people that are within a particular location. This is an example of a utopian public space, and this is an artist's impression of what's going to happen in a space in Dubai. And so looking at this now, this kind of leads me into my next slide, which is some actual public spaces. And what I say in that is designing for the greater good. But what I was highlighting to these students, and I'll get to a point of why I'm talking about this, is there were some downfalls in this public space, is that that lacked places to sit, there was limited protection to the elements, and in some cases aesthetically not pleasing and very concrete based. Also, this is a typical, example of, well, designed for the greater good, where you see, okay, on your left-hand side of your screen, you can see, oh, there's a sign for disabled access, but is there really, a proper way that people can get through? Or you see on the right-hand side, the ramp. Now, I don't know, but that would be quite a difficult kind of obstacle for some people to kind of maneuver in that. So basically what I was saying was that you can't always design for the greater good. You need to kind of involve a variety of stakeholders in that process. So interesting what I have looked at over my research period, and also drawing on my experience as an engagement consultant, is how we can go from top down to bottom up to middle out. And essentially it's moving towards a middle ground where you're involving people. So that leads me back to my very basic engagement spectrum, where I will kind of demonstrate how it fits within the level of engagement. And I'm going to talk about urban interventions as a mechanism that I use as placed in public space to engage communities around localized topics. So if we think about back to traditional community engagement practices and methods, this is an example of Barangaroo here in Sydney, which was a large state government infrastructure project. And during that process, they ran a series of town halls and focus groups. There was web platforms with information that people could log on and see as the project kind of unfolded, and as it's now started to be quite a large development. But if we look here, this is your kind of basic traditional town hall style, which Diane was also talking about, and not necessarily coming with great outcomes. There's also a picture there of your typical workshop style, and this is for a client and a project that I ran. It was more about an information only. The project was decided. It was going in that local community. It was really just an exercise for people to come along, get some information about what it was about, but ultimately they weren't really involved in the decision making. Again, you have your typical workshop style, which are very effective. You can come along, you can speak to professionals, the engineers, the designers, the people that are going to be involved in that decision-making process. And then you've also got your typical online platforms where you have your say. Again, it's you need to log on to a website, it's information only. You might be able to leave comments, but are you ultimately involved in the decision-making? So when we talk about bottom-up examples, you see here there's the whole DIY and guerrilla tactics that we see all over the world. And a typical example here is yarn bombing. And I was most recently in Europe, and walking through a very hot day during Madrid at about 40 degrees, I came across this water fountain, and it had been yarn bombed. And I had to take a picture because, well, it's really interesting to see these things around different cities in the world. And essentially what yarn bombing is, apart from making a statement, it's also taking ownership around a local community. And these bottom-up community groups or activists have taken ownership of items and spaces within their public space. And also, another great example I always like to show on the screen on the right-hand side is a bike lane. Now, that wasn't a bike lane put in by the local council or by a state government. That was done by the community. And it's a reaction to car-dominated space where cyclists and pedestrians are essentially not considered. And this local community put their own bike lane in and took ownership of that space. And another real favourite one, and really topical at the moment, particularly in Australia after the marriage equality vote that just came through yesterday. This is a picture of the 35th anniversary of the City Mardi Gras, and the local government put in a rainbow crossing, which was highly successful. It brought a lot of people to the area. It kind of revitalised the area, and as a result of deemed by the state government was that this crossing caused some hazards. People were stopping in the middle of the road, taking photos, and so they deemed that it was a hazard and decided to take it down. But what they didn't really do is they didn't consult with the local community. They didn't consult with local businesses. In actual fact, people were in opposition to this. And so in retaliation, people started to put up their own DIY rainbow crossings. And it happened not just in Sydney, but across Australia in protest to say, well, we wanted that there. It created a new vibrancy to the area. And this was kind of a reaction, people saying, well, no, we didn't want that. And so we saw a whole lot of DIY chalk rainbow crossings. If anyone, in Sydney, and for people that are overseas, this is what that area, Oxford Street in Sydney, looks like. There's a lot of closed down shops, empty shops, as a result of how things are changing in the city, lockout laws, and there's not a lot of activity happening at night time, so businesses are closing down. So that is kind of reactions to government top-down decision making. Just quickly again, another couple of Sydney examples. State government also said that they they are rehousing public housing areas, and they'll be redeveloped. The one on the left-hand side is a well-known public housing area that residents are going to be rehomed and put in a new location. But as a protest against that, they, in collaboration with a local artist, is that they did this lighting, Waterloo public housing lighting project, and the residents put lighting in their house to kind of protest against the state government decision. And then the other one is a brutalist architecture building, which again was public housing, and the state government was going to sell it off, and as a big retaliation from the public, there has been some back down into that. So that kind of leads me into the use of technologies in urban environments for engaging people. And here's a couple of examples of using digital technologies in local communities to engage citizens around local topics. And that's been done through the use of existing media facades on buildings, and using technology that essentially integrates interactions between existing infrastructure and communities. So that leads me to Middleout, and you might wonder, what does Middleout mean? And essentially, it's a process that originated from an engineering and social sciences background, where those domains wanted to engage with their employees around redesign and redevelopment of workplace practice and also their product. And instead of saying, well, we as the business know the best, they wanted to bring in the advice, the expertise of their employees, and that was where this original concept has come from. But myself and a colleague from the Queensland University of Technology, Glenda Caldwell, and I have further extended this this concept for a community engagement perspective. And basically, it's a process that brings the collective knowledge of both the top down, so private enterprise and local government and government agencies, with those of the everyday people from the bottom, community groups, all different types of demographics, to come together and meet in the middle and work together. So basically, as you can see here, the Middleout process is bringing those top government and private enterprise organizations down together, and bottom-up groups like culturally and linguistically diverse communities or younger demographics, which can quite often be left out in the engagement process, to meet somewhere in the middle. So, Middleout Design is a process that actually sits in the initial stages of community engagement. And basically, it's to design collaboratively community engagement with people before you actually go out and run the engagement process. So there's 3 phases to it: design, implementation, and deployment. And you actually do that at the initial stages before you even get out there and run your community engagement. It would be consulting and collaborating with a variety of stakeholders around the way that they actually want to be engaged. So the three stages are, who do you want to engage with, which is the design process; implementing it, as in what tools you might use. For example, is it just digital or is it physical interactions or physical media? And then the deployment, which is where you actually hold the engagement. So as a process of kind of uncovering this, this methodology, I actually ran a series of urban interventions, which was placing pop-up interventions in public spaces. The first of that, which was in collaboration with a local government here in Sydney, which is what we call Vote As You Go, was utilising an existing urban screen through movements and interactions where people could vote on local topics. And in this case, it was around local government services and increases to the levy and or rates within that area. And basically what people could do was, there was 2 kind of interventions. There was one where we had an iPad that you could type in a yes/no answer, and it would show the cumulative results on the screen. And so, it was actually placed there with the means of just attracting passers-by, not necessarily signed or had a great agenda. And that was what we were trying to slowly unpack as researchers. And what that also did was, we had a full screen kind of body movement interaction where people could use their body to vote by standing on either side of the large urban screen, as I hope you can see on the videos that are showing. And basically, it was to interact with passers-by. So the engagement channels that we used for this process, and when I talk about engagement channels, is the actual mechanism, the input or output mechanisms in which people could interact and see the results of the community engagement. So we used a live camera feed using an existing urban screen where they could interact and also see the results. And then we also had a tablet device in which they could input their responses. So our next project used a different component, and again, in this case, we're only using digital technologies, but we wanted to introduce a pop-up kind of structure where it might have attracted people in a different sense than just the standalone, iPad or the screen themselves. And we ran a few different types of interventions, where different type, you know, an umbrella or a gazebo structure. We used different types of furniture. We introduced some plants just to kind of see if it made a difference. And then what we also did is to introduce signage so people could see what it was all about, because it was a little bit confusing in the first ones where, you know, passers-by might not have known what we were actually talking about. So we, as our kind of experiment, we wanted to see if an unstaffed pop-up could attract people and entice them into engagement around the topics that were shown on the iPad and also shown on the urban screen. And we found that it actually wasn't that successful, because we weren't trying to converse people into engagement. We were more seeing if it would create organic or natural involvement. But then in our subsequent interventions, we used what we call a staff pop-up, where there was always a constant presence of someone there to talk about the project and involve them. So we used a series of like camera feeds, the urban screen, and the tablet device, similar to the other project. Kind of moving on to that and kind of finding out about our shortfalls, we thought about a digitally augmented experience where you could use both digital and analog components together. And basically what that involved was using the digital components where people could, in this case, take selfies. The context of this study was around trees and tree trimming, which is a highly controversial topic. And basically, we gave people the option to answer their questions by either taking selfies with an iPad, or they could fill out the same questions using paper. And we also had a game where they could visualize trees and power lines and how that would actually, what the actual issue was in that case. So again, you know, we used a variety of digital and analog input and output mechanisms. And our kind of the final study in which we were using was what we call PopSpot, and basically this used a series of digital, analog, and mechanical input and output mechanisms, and again in collaboration with a local with the local community, and also with this, in this case, was the university. It was around transport, and basically what we wanted to do was to kind of give people the option, the opportunity to talk about transport options at the University of Sydney, and through that they could do that through a drawing robot, or there was a digital touch screen where they could see transport options and see contextually relevant points of interest around the area. So what we also did in this is the kind of main thing was also providing people with a variety of options. Not only could they use digital means, but they could use simple things like a chalkboard, and they could basically write what they thought about transport and say whatever they liked. It was an open platform, an open slather where they could say whatever they wanted. And also as a kind of physical means of showing the results was that we chalked the results of what types of transport options people took to the university, as you can see on the screen there. So basically what that led to was this Middleout Design process, and as I was touching on before, it's the three components of design, implementation, and deployment, and they fit in the initial stages of that engagement process. So if we go back to what I was talking with the engagement of objectives of engagement and then decision making, this design process sits at the very start, and it's a kind of iterative process. You go through, you see you have the input from people. You come back around and you make changes. It's not linear. It continuously goes around. It's very similar to a participatory design process where you're involving a whole lot of people within that process, except participatory designs at the deployment stage, where Middleout Design continues to keep those stakeholders involved within the whole process, because you might find that you need to make changes whilst you're actually conducting and doing your community engagement. So, as I said, that's just another example of where Middleout Design sits in the community engagement design process, or the actual process of community engagement. And basically, as I said, it's bringing the top and the bottom together and working towards a more collaborative approach. And this diagram says collaborative city making, but Middleout Design doesn't have to just be used for city making. It can be used for any type of engagement, whether that be internal engagement in organizations, policy changes, or anything in which you wanted to obtain feedback around a process. So, just to wrap it all up, there's kind of 4 main parts of using these types of digital and analog components for community engagement. It's the context, scale, and timing. So making sure that it's contextually relevant, that the timing and the scale of the deployment of your engagement is relevant to that local community. Evaluating the impact of the community engagement, making sure that your intervention is attractive, that it involves a variety of demographics, and they're actually collecting relevant information, and people feel as if that they are involved, that you're demonstrating that there's a sense of transparency, which leads to balancing transparency and credibility. So making sure that there are contributions from a variety of top and bottom down stakeholders, and essentially deploying interactive installations that use a variety of media around topics that address local and citywide topics. So that's pretty much it. I hope that that's been good.
Very, very good, Joel. I think we've heard about kind of in the system from Diane, how you work with people in the system where they've come to the meeting, and we've now heard about how you use technology from Joel to get people into the system. I want to ask both of you, how do you get the people who are the most difficult, that is the decision makers, to accept the information, to engage in this information, and to make their decisions based on this kinds of information? How do we do that? Let's start with you, Diane.
Sure. And I see my mic is green, so I'm assuming you can hear me. Is that right, Ed?
That's right.
And do you want me to turn on my cam or no?
No cam.
All right. So yeah, it's kind of at the heart of the issue when dealing with these processes, because if the ultimate decision makers, who are setting policy, don't believe that the engagement is important, or they don't understand what is important to the community, and they're making decisions without that, or what we have more here in Austin, Texas, is that they want to do a lot of community engagement, but they struggle with what is all this engagement and what we've heard mean, and how are we going to make that hard choice in the end. So that's why the part about really understanding what is your decision-making process, how are you going to use the input, what effect will it have on what's happening or what's going to be decided, having that really clear, and everybody realizing that kind of at the beginning and throughout the process is really key. It's kind of the so what factor. And so the challenge with this work a lot of times is that it's difficult, and it takes a while, and particularly when you're dealing with really contentious, complex issues. And I think everybody gets engagement fatigue, and so part of the work as a practitioner is really continually getting clear on the purpose and process and payoff, I guess I would say, about this work, and really being sure that everybody's clear about that and on the same page. So that's kind of one way I've tried to tackle that challenge.
Joel, what's your response to that?
Yeah, look, I also agree what Diane said, but I think having spoken to a lot of engagement practitioners and being involved in it myself, I know that there are a lot of people in local government that genuinely want to have feedback and discussion with local communities from a variety of demographics within this process. And I think there are some decision makers that are open to wanting to hear from these people, wanting their valid responses into how they're ultimately going to make the decisions. And I think there has started to be a change in realizing that not only do you need to have a variety of stakeholders involved in the engagement process, but also that there's a value in communication and stakeholder engagement practitioners being at the decision-making table as well, apart from just being the people that are facilitating it or having been told what they have to do from these ultimate decision makers, to actually being sitting at the table beginning when they're planning how they're going to engage with people, and ultimately what the input from the community is going to have in the final decision-making process. So I think it's a process which is going to change. I think as more governments and top-down decision makers realise that that you need to involve a variety of people, will actually give you greater outcomes. And I think we're coming into a world where we have access to so much more information. We have greater platforms to have our say. If we're unhappy with something, we're online giving our opinions or making comments or trolling. I think as technology evolves and as society has become increasingly well connected, there's no choice for decision makers to rethink their approach and ultimately involve a variety of stakeholders in the decision-making process.
Well, for us to get some better ideas of what the people on the other end want, we'd like to get some questions from the audience, the listeners, the viewers. What are the things that are bothering you? Because we have here what I call the ideals from Diane and Joel. I'm involved in these processes. I'm one of those people called the decision maker. And we get tons of information. But some of us who were old school, I won't count myself in that number, think the reason we got elected, we must know what's right for the community, or we wouldn't have been elected. So no matter what feedback comes in, from whom, we were elected, so we have the right to make this decision. And furthermore, we're much better informed. So I'd like to hear from some of you who are struggling with these issues. I find the best thing from my point of view is to what I call give up. Don't assume I know. And that's very difficult for a decision maker, because how'd you get elected if you don't know? Right?
So I'm just to jump in a little bit. So Diane, have you addressed that challenge and I'm just thinking through your model that you showed earlier, you know, to actually get to, if you're empowering the community, then does that necessarily mean you're disempowering decision makers?
Yeah. We got the votes.
Well, yeah, the key to really some of this work is to, you know, have folks in the community sharing with decision makers what are those things they hold valuable. What is it that's important to them? What do they care about? What do they really want to see in their lives, in their community? And what are they concerned about? What isn't working with regard to how certain issues are getting handled, and have those conversations, as well as helping provide community members the information they need about the tough choices and trade-offs and tensions within those decisions that have to be made, and create conditions where they can, meaning the community and hopefully the decision makers also, grapple with some of those hard choices. You know, I think I've been involved in way too many engagement efforts in certainly my early days getting involved in this work, where it was all about, what's your vision, what do you want to see happen, what if you could have anything, you know, blue sky, what would you like? And that's really in the end kind of the frustrating and the wrong way to go, because really all of this stuff is about making hard choices and about the trade-offs inherent and about the tensions between things that we hold valuable, or the degree to which we might prioritize what we hold valuable. So a great example is freedom and security. You know, we want to have freedom, but we also want security. Well, where's the sweet spot? And when policymakers and decision makers can engage the community in those kinds of conversations, which are kind of sophisticated, but it's doable, how that helps them understand where is the kind of stronger ground, the shared ground, like the place that they can start making choices from that are actually going to be doable and supported and sustained in the community. So, you know, for simpler choices, more kind of technical issues, you know, what should we do with the, you know, the day on which the garbage gets picked up, you know, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, how are we going to keep our housing affordable in our city when it's risen, you know, astronomically. Those kinds of tough challenges, really, it's important for policymakers to recognize that, kind of in my jargon, we call it informed public judgment, but like, what are regular people grappling with? How do they view the issues? What do they hold valuable? And then where are some of these possible choices, these policy choices, these decisions we might make? What are people willing to live with, and what aren't they? And that can inform decision making. So that's kind of the way I think about how kind of that Edward letting go you're talking about. It's really, you know, it's like listening. It's kind of holding the container for the conversation to happen as an elected, so that you can understand what really is important to people and what they're really kind of willing to live with when it comes to those hard choices that you ultimately have to vote on and decide.
Yeah. Before you respond to that, Joel, I would just want to add a little amendment of something you might know about in Chatswood. They're talking about policy choices and parking and things like this. And I think I saw a picture of Chatswood, as a matter of fact. Have you seen, Joel, people actually changing a decision as a result of these processes that you used?
Yes, yes. So in one of the examples that I quickly went through was working with a local electricity supplier, and they actually had identified that their approach to this tree trimming was an issue with community. People were really upset about what they had done, hadn't been informed, didn't really understand why they had this beautiful jacaranda tree out the front of the house before they went to work, and when they came home it was chopped down. And so yes, through that kind of engagement process in which we ran a whole series of these pop-ups in diverse local communities, and got a variety of feedback, which we fed back to this organisation, that they acknowledged that this was an issue, and that they then decided to informed change. And as a process of that, they actually did a whole more series of engagement with local councils, with community groups, and elected representatives. So I think that there is opportunity, there is acknowledgement from organisations around community sentiment and needing to make change, and to kind of go into that further and further build on what Diane was saying, is that I think there's a need for mediating engagement, and that goes to my whole top-down and bottom-up process. not discounting that that elected representatives or top-down decision makers have a one-sided agenda. I don't think that that is necessarily the truth. They have a job to do, and not everybody understands that at times. But then you also have very genuine and legitimate ideas and concerns from people at the bottom up. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be greater partnerships between those people at the top that are making the decisions, but also getting information and feedback from everyday people at the bottom. So I think there's an opportunity for a middle ground for mediating engagement, and whether that is engagement practitioners or people like myself, which are researchers, that are sitting there at the middle with no agenda. They're not driving anything. They're not forcing it onto anybody. It's more that they are the people to help raise awareness around particular issues, help kind of bring people together to create effective approaches, and also help to reach beyond social, cultural, and political divides by initiating discussions that people that might not have thought about before or considered. And I think what that ultimately does is it brings many voices, actors, and methods together to kind of involve a variety of people. As I keep saying, involving a variety of people. And I think there needs to be a middle ground between these top-down decision makers and just everyday people that want to contribute towards that ultimate decision.
Very good. I think we had to wind up here. There's one thing I'd like to say, having been in this process, and I think you both have said in a way, involvement shouldn't be around an issue. It should be constant. And now that we have these technologies, you can have a web page, you can have a Facebook page and things where you're asking questions, you're interacting all the time. I think every member of council ought to spend 1 hour in the box, as they say, every week, listening to what people have to say and having a conversation with them and not waiting until they walk into a council meeting, because these techniques are very good. And furthermore, when the council has workshops, why not have a workshop with the community before the council or whatever, the state body makes the decision. Even if it doesn't come out the way people would like because it's popular, for example, if someone wants to put a mosque in the neighborhood, which is a religious right, people have to understand why. And if they haven't been involved in discussions about new people coming in and the needs and the rights they have, then that's a tough issue when they could have had a discussion where people understand it's going to arise. We have to buzz out now, but I think the smartest cities are those who use these techniques, both the soft techniques that Diane described and the harder technology techniques that Joel described, to be really smart about how they learn from their communities.
Thank you, Ed. And just to wrap up, I think is with a couple of comments, and that is just simply thank Diane and Joel today for your insights. I think they come from different perspectives but coalesce around the same challenges and some really wonderful frameworks to use for a solution. Just as a way of thinking about continuing this conversation, there are some webinars coming up which may also be of interest to you. On the 21st of November will be the webinar at 10 a.m. on creating a culture of innovation, both in your community and within your organisation. On the 28th of November, we have the Urban Data and Governance webinar. And then on the 7th of December, before you go into your festivities for the end of the year, we'll start talking about finance and funding. But I do want to thank you all on the line for your time today. It is sometimes challenging in the webinar to keep everybody engaged, but we were able to do that for the last hour or more. We will send a follow-up email with the presentations. So if you're able to share those with colleagues and start thinking about the issue further, I hope that's useful. So closing off today, and look forward to seeing you very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.